All right, this is module 20, which is community ecology. All right, so for this, it's kind of remind you of biology, I guess. You've probably talked a lot about this in biology. But we're talking about communities and competition and ecology and how they interact. So community ecology is basically studying how the communities interact, how those species interact. So that is the basis of a lot of environmental science. And so there's different relationships that organisms have. So one is a symbiotic relationship. So basically, they live in close association with one another. They generally interact with one another and help each other out. That would be a positive interaction. And then negative interactions, there's a variety. There's competition, predation, parasitism, and herbivory. So we'll talk about all of those coming up. All right, so all organisms have some kind of competition. So whether it's with other organisms of their own or other species in general, but they all have some sort of competition. It could be food, it could be shelter, something along those lines. So when two species have the same niche, so they have the same realized niche, meaning that they both share a common area that they can both live in. One species will then outperform the other. So if they don't have other areas where they can go or like other food sources, then one of those species will end up being pushed out. If they have a variety of things that they can both eat or shelter, then they can both coexist. And they'll still be in competition for one specific thing, but they'll be able to coexist. So there's two varieties there, and we'll talk about both here. So here's some competition between paramecium. So we've got two paramecium, and if you look at the top picture, these are both grown separately. So both these types, these species of paramecium, grown separately, they both thrive. So after a few days, the number of individuals goes up exponentially or quite fast, actually, and then tapers off. So it reaches the carrying capacity. And then here you can see same thing, paramecium increase, and then they taper off. So this is a typical S-shaped curve. And so they are not in competition with each other because they're grown separately. But notice what happens when they're grown together. So there definitely is competition. They are eating the same food source, unlike the graph that we looked at a couple notes ago. So notice how this species dies off. So this species was in direct competition with the orange species. The orange outsurvived the green or blue. And so basically there's competition and this one won, this one lost. But away from each other, they both can thrive. So they both had the same niche, same food source, and this one had seemingly no other food source. So this one was just better suited for that food source, so it outperformed this one. If this one had another food source that it could rely on, then potentially they could have coexisted, but in this case, they didn't. So that's one example of a competition for a limiting resource. So that limiting resource in this example is probably food. All right. So we've got other types of competition. We've got resource partitioning. So let's say that two species are eating different seed sizes, like in this example. So we've got species one is a strong competitor. So it's strong, meaning maybe it's more aggressive, it's got a stronger beak, or something along those lines. So it's strong competitor. And then this species two is a weak competitor. So right now, they both live in that same realized niche, but notice how they're both competing for this general seed size. So this species one, the stronger competitor, is going to outperform species two. So in this scenario, after time, species one takes over. So notice how its bell-shaped curve basically comes over and takes over for the yellow, species two, and then the yellow shifts. So the yellow, because the yellow ate large seed sides and the green didn't, they're both able to coexist. The species two, the ones that maybe preferred this seed size, became extinct, or not extinct, but just were selected against. And so now they're not in that community anymore. And so now we just have these species two eating mostly the larger seed sizes, and then green is eating the small and medium. And so they're both able to exist because they both have other sources. They have limiting resources, the seeds, but they're both able to meet their needs in other ways. So that would be an example of resource partitioning. All right, so some predation. Predation is one animal killing another, and a parasitoid is a specialized type of predator. So this predator lays eggs inside another organism and uses it as a host to either raise its own or as food source for its young, which is pretty gross. So I'll show you a video about a caterpillar that this happens to, and it's pretty nasty, but it's interesting. So you have to watch.
This wriggling little guy is a baby braconid wasp. It's bursting out of a cottonwood dagger caterpillar and starting to spin a cocoon. Believe it or not, this somewhat gruesome scene is part of a healthy, balanced ecosystem. Until now, the caterpillar served as the wasp's food and nursery. Braconid wasps are parasitoids. That means they first infect but eventually kill their host animals to survive. Regular parasites generally don't kill their hosts outright. The cycle begins when a parasitoid lays eggs inside or on the caterpillar or on top of the caterpillar's food. As the larvae hatch and grow, they feed on the caterpillar's internal organs. They often save the most important parts for last to keep their host alive. Some parasitoids, like this tachinid fly, grow to nearly the same size as their host before bursting out. After emerging from the caterpillar, these parasitoids pupate and develop into adults. Then they search for a new host to lay eggs, starting the cycle over. Parasitoids have a special purpose. They keep their host populations in check. Without them, the caterpillar population could skyrocket out of control and destroy the trees that they eat. Some parasitoids are used to help control invasive species and pests that otherwise could devastate the environment. So, they can help keep the ecosystem healthy. Sometimes, helpful things come in wriggling packages.
So pretty gross. It kind of reminds me of the movie Alien, where the alien bursts out of the guy's stomach. But I couldn't imagine being eaten from the inside out. That's pretty gross. So moving on to what they were talking about with parasitism. So the parasitism, it generally doesn't eat its host or kill its host. So like a tick, for example, it doesn't directly kill a host. The reason it would kill a host accidentally would be like disease. So sometimes ticks carry disease, and so that would be something that it spreads, but it doesn't. It's not. Its purpose isn't to do that. So parasitism is just interacting. It's living off another organism. So sometimes it doesn't harm the host. Sometimes it does. And then a pathogen is a parasite that causes disease. So a tick is a parasite, but it's also could be a pathogen. And so it's causing disease in its host, not intentionally, but because it's maybe a deer tick and it picked up Lyme disease from a deer, for example. So generally they don't kill their hosts. They could, but generally they don't want to. That's not to their benefit at all because they're living off of you or something else. All right, and then herbivory. So herbivory is eating plants. So basically, caterpillar, for example, consuming a producer. They can definitely have a dramatic effect. So, like they talked about in the video, a parasitoid can be a good thing because it keeps the caterpillar numbers in check. And caterpillars can do a number on plants. They can completely destroy a plant, like you can see in this picture here. If we've got an overabundance of caterpillars, then we can destroy a forest or a small area of the forest very quickly. So they kind of keep everything in check, like they were talking about. All right, and then mutualism. Mutualism is where they both benefit. So you can see this ant eating the nectar of the acacia tree. So the acacia tree is not injured, and the ant sometimes helps to spread pollen, but it also stings any predators that come to eat the acacia. So the um, ants get nectar, they get food, and the acacia tree gets protection from predators. And so it works both ways. So mutualism, both benefit. Commensalism, there's a relationship between two species where one is benefiting and the other is not harmed. So here's an emo. And so the clownfish is in the anemone. And so the anemone is not benefiting from this. There's no benefit for that. But the clownfish is protected because the anemone stings anything that is near it. The clownfish is immune to that sting. And so the clownfish is stung too. It's just that it's immune to that. So it's protected, and so the clownfish is benefiting. The anemone is not, but it's not harmed either. So that's commensalism. All right, so if we look at this interaction between these species, so here's competition. So here's all the different types of interaction. So competition, species one, species two, they both have negative impact. So they both are competing for the same resource. One of them is going to win. In the meantime, another one is suffering because it's competing. So predation, we've got one species is positive, and then the other one is negatively affected. And then you can see as we go through parasitism, same thing. One benefits, one doesn't. Herbivory, one benefits, one doesn't. Mutualism, they both benefit. And commensalism, one benefits, one there is no harm, but no benefit either. All right, and then that brings us to the last part, which is a keystone species. So keystone species are species that kind of tie in that community. So I'll give you an example when we watch a video next, which is called Wolves in Yellowstone, how wolves change rivers. And so a keystone species plays a big role in an ecosystem, a far bigger role than you can even imagine, for example. So the wolves, you'll see in the video that the wolves had a huge impact, not only on species but on landscape, which is kind of amazing. And then an ecosystem engineer, it's basically just a keystone species that maintains a habitat for another species. So example, beavers in Yellowstone, they build dams, and the video will touch a little bit on that. But they build dams, and those dams help to curb rivers and make other habitat for fish and birds and things like that. So they're also a keystone species, but they have a special role in that they make something that is useful for something else. So, like I mentioned, the beaver with making a dam. So that is an engineer as well.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. But the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitat. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So pretty cool how wolves change rivers and how much a keystone species is actually really important. And that's it. And I will see you next time.